Hello there and welcome to Black Jackal Gaming. Today we're going to look at strategy and how it's your first step to victory. We're going to take a look at what strategy actually is, how it differs from tactics because it's often confused with tactics, ways that you can shape strategy to benefit you in 40k, and how to develop a more zoomed out approach to 40k list building. So what actually is strategy? So the general definition for strategy is a general plan to achieve one or more long-term goals under uncertain conditions. What this essentially means is that you set forward a basic plan of what you want to achieve, and it's usually in the midst of something that is slightly more chaotic where there isn't consistent and predictable outcomes. As you can see, this isn't something where we really go into the specifics of how you achieve the goals. It's setting a broad outline of what your goal is and the overall manner or flavour and how you achieve these goals using it. On the battlefield, this is really going to revolve around our ability to create, restrict and utilise space. This is both for ourselves and our opponent. And it's also looking into using pressure and timing to help achieve our goals. So what are tactics in comparison? They're the details of how you achieve your strategy and exactly how you plan to carry this out by using your tactics. So as Sun Tzu said, strategy without tactics is the slowest route to victory. Tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. So these are basically your decisions you're going to make turn by turn to achieve our goals. This is whether it's going to be which flank we're going to utilize our attacks down, how aggressive we're going to be in our movements, and how we're going to react or predict how our enemy moves and how this is going to affect us with our damage output and the damage we receive. It's also our flexibility based on the information. So these are the decisions we make turn by turn, battle round by battle round, that help us to achieve our goals. Our tactics are how we choose to engage with the enemy, which flank we are going to utilize our attacks down, how aggressive we are going to move in and out the different phases of battle, and how we're going to react to our enemy's movement, whether it be the damage they're inflicting on us or the damage we're going to inflict on them. It's the flexibility based on the information in front of us where we can pivot from one tactic to another. It's essentially how we are going to engage step by step with the opponent rather than an overall zoomed out approach where we look at the battlefield and decide exactly how we are going to achieve our goals of winning. So how do we devise our strategy? Well, to start with, we have to really focus on what our goals actually are going to be. And this is before we've even considered writing a list. So the basic principles apply to every game we are going to play. We've got 1 to score points and 2 to score more points than our opponent. No matter what 40 game we play, what army we're playing, what opponent we're against, the mission, the key goal is to score points and score more than the opponent. So we follow this up with how are we going to successfully meet these goals, and these are where our strategy comes into play. So now that we've decided on the victory outcome, that's scoring points and scoring more points than the opponent, we have to set out the manner in which we approach these goals, and then we can use this overall manner to devise the tactics to implement. For example, if we wish to limit the points scored by our opponent rather than scoring more points than them, then what approach can we take? So we will still be looking to maximize our points, but we might not necessarily be aiming to get 95 or 100 points. We can take the approach of if we restrict our opponent's points, we don't have to actually accrue as many points ourselves. So this is all dependent on your opponent, the mission, the terrain layout, and the army we have, but there are things we can consider, such as pressure. We have to consider how we're going to assert pressure on the opponent. And we do this by thinking, how is it going to prevent our opponent from functioning? So we've got a couple of different ways to do this, such as limiting the space they can operate in, limiting their access to objectives, and limiting their access to their main damage profile for their weapons. Now, this is all part of our approach of minimizing the amount of points that they can score. So if we limit the space they can operate in, it makes it difficult for them to score secondary objectives. And if we limit their access to the objectives, they're going to have difficulty scoring their primaries. So this minimizes the impact it has on us to score our primaries and secondaries, because if we are limiting the opponent, then we don't have to maximize the amount of points we score ourselves. And the other form of pressure is the main damage focus of the opponent. If we can prevent them from accessing their damage profiles, then they're not going to really be able to harm us sufficiently to stop us from scoring points. Another one could be movement, and this is how we can move to prevent the enemy from scoring points. Again, we're considering this in the guise of we are aiming to restrict the points scored from the opponents, and this is the overall strategy we'll be taking. So aspects of movement could be limiting their visibility to our units so they can't bring forth their damage profiles, they can't use certain abilities, and this would also harm their ability to score some secondaries as well. We can force them to make a lot of reactive movements if we have a lot of speed and we can get across to different sections of the board, which opens up scoring secondaries and primaries for us. They will have to be quite reactive to how we are moving, especially some armies have certain rules built into potentially being stationary or focusing on one unit with multiple of their own units. This limits their ability to engage with their own rules to maximize their damage output. There's also abilities such as Deep Strike, and this creates a future threat that they have to consider. So this could limit their movement early game because they want to screen out the deployment, and by doing so, we're going to actually restrict, by not actually moving, we're going to restrict them from scoring points because they are going to be within their deployment zone. And if they do decide to move out of the deployment zone, then it gives us space to operate where we can Deep Strike in and score secondary points and take their home objective. There's also the ability to use moving to block key units. So you can go into movement channels. Say, for example, you're fighting an army that has a lot of vehicles, so they can't go through terrain. You can use your key movements to block areas so they cannot move through it to get onto objectives or score secondaries. You can also use this to tie up shooting units into combat by getting in combat with them and minimizing their output. You can also include timing of your movements. Now, we don't want to, right at the start of the game, all rush out, hit our firing lanes, hit the main channels they want to move down, and try and press space by being too aggressive, because they can utilize this against us. We want to time our movements to come into waves to disrupt our enemy in specific turns where we want to hurt them the most. Now, there's also the art of deception. So this is about how can we make the enemy think they are in a strong position. There's other forms of deception, but when it comes to games, one of the key deceptive tactics within the strategy is to make the opponent think they're in a strong position when they're actually on weak ground. So how can we do this? Well, we can build a list that can utilize scoring points in turns 3 onwards, so turns 3, 4, and 5. So this can put the opponent in a position where they score more points than us in the first turn or two, putting themselves in a position where they think they are winning the game. But we've built our list to score points later on and swing the balance of the game without them even realizing it's about to happen. There's also using timing. We need to layer our damage output certain times. We can utilize certain turns where we can target the opponent to really disrupt their ability to achieve their outcomes, to score points, to move into areas where they can pick up additional primary objectives. We can also bait traps for them as well. We can set up positions where they think it's advantageous for them to move into certain parts of the board, or where they think they're weak and they're going to counter attack our position. But we are using this to actually set up some possibly strong combinations, intelligent use of stratagems to have really destructive turns that are slightly out of sequence to what they're expecting. And there's also the ability to trade units. Trading units is a key part of 40k, but we can have the appearance of poorly trading a key unit that is there to seem like it's an important part of our strategy, but doesn't actually have a major effect of meeting our goals. It's not part of our tactics to achieve our overall aim. So we can trade this unit, making the opposition believe they're in the ascendancy because they've taken out a key part of our army, whereas this unit only has the perception of being important, where it is really nothing but a Trojan horse. There's another quote that I think is quite apt when it comes to 40k, and this is to engage people with what they expect. It is what they're able to discern and confirms their projections. It settles them into predictable patterns of response, occupying their minds while you wait for an extraordinary moment, that which they cannot anticipate. It's by breaking norms and trends. If you create a list in an army that plays in the manner it's expected to play, using the units everyone uses, using the tactics and strategy that everyone uses, then everyone knows how to play against this army. So you're putting yourself in a position where you have to actually be a much better player to achieve your goals. Now, if we break the norm and operate in a manner that's not expected, but we project in a manner that they expect us to operate in, we can use this to our advantage to turn key parts in the game which they're not expecting. Now, there are strategies to use to maximize our point scoring, and the majority of what's already been mentioned can be used to achieve these goals, but there's additional things on top that we can consider. So we can consider a certain amount of non-interaction. So this is focused on moving around the board, optimizing scoring points, and not optimizing interacting with the opponent. So this isn't a damage dealing game. This is a decision making, point scoring game. So we don't actually need to always engage with the enemy to score points. There's certain secondaries that we can choose that emphasize this, but there's also a lot of secondary objectives that don't have any interaction in whatsoever. So certain armies can choose to move around the board and basically play a solo game. There's also the option of alpha striking, which is often a popular choice because people do like to do damage. They do like to kill things. So alpha striking is about front loading our damage in turns 1 or 2. A lot of the time, specifically in turn 1, because this can prevent our enemy from having any ability to score points or carry out their tactics or strategy. If we can take out key units, whether it's units that are set up to move around the board to score points, or supporting units that have buffing auras or abilities that really allow them to play to their best ability, or it could be something towards the lines of the key damage causing units. Like if you're playing against a tower army, for example, and turn 1 you knock out their crisis suits and the damage dealing units, well actually you've targeted some of their key tough, fast durable units that are there to do a lot of damage to allow them to score points. There's also durability. A couple of the armies really lean into this, like the Death Guard, for example. This is where you choose to become basically an immovable force, and you want to stand on objectives, and you want to stand there and say, come and take me off because I've got high toughness, high wounds, I've got ability to make me more durable, whether it's reduction to damage, whether it's -1 to be hit, -1 to be wounded, if I've got Phenol Banes built in. And on top of this, they often have additional objective control. So you want to dominate the primary objectives and stand there and not be moved by your opponent. And if they do focus fire on you, it's going to take a substantial amount of firepower to take you out. And whilst they're doing that, you get to punch back on other fronts in the game. So what could our strategy be, bearing in mind what we've gone through? So we know the overall of the game is to score points and make sure we score more than our opponent. So bearing this in mind, we can set a strategy to potentially score in the region of 80 plus points whilst trying to limit our opponent's ability to score. So try and keep them down around the 60 points. So we want a little bit of buffer zone between us in case we do score lower or they score a bit higher. But we can set this up in the game with how we act. So the route to this goal will be potentially to apply pressure on the opposition. We want to look at restricting the space they can operate in and potentially aim to keep them in and around the deployment zone, which makes them difficult to push out, take objectives, and score the secondary objectives at the same time. So the aim of this would be to really limit their access to primary objectives, keeping them down to maybe 5-10 points a turn. As well as this is going to prevent them from scoring a lot of the secondary objectives, especially the ones that are slightly easier to score. So by limiting the space they can move out of the deployment zone, we actually make it easier for us to access both primary and secondary objectives. And we've got ways to minimize the impact of going second as well. Whether we take the early ground in the deployment phase by having units that have the scouts keyword, or potentially with infiltrators to take those objectives early on, especially if they're tough to use units. Some armies have abilities where you can add infiltrators or scouts to units that don't naturally have them. So you can target ones that are quite durable to move into the space. You've also got the ability to deep strike as well and have this threat. So the opponent has to think about what can come behind their lines to cause them damage and take their home objective. Additionally, we really want to protect our deployment zone from deep striking as well. It's pointless pushing forward, applying pressure onto the opponent if they can either just fly over us or drop into the space below. We've got to zone out their access to the objectives and the space and make it really hard for them to occupy this space. And we can often do this by using cheap resources such as units of cultists or units that have abilities that create a buffer zone such as Space Marine infiltrators. And then if this doesn't work, we always have to have a plan B. Now the plan B should be very similar to our current strategy, but the way that we implement it might be slightly different. So our plan B could be to have the same objective by creating pressure, limiting their access to space and objectives. Or if they do break out their deployment zone, well, we can pivot our attack. Instead of containing them to their deployment zone, we can just contain them to 2 table quarters potentially. So we can pivot our mode of attack and apply pressure on them, allow them to occupy the same space they would in the deployment zone, but they're not occupying more space than we want them to. We're not allowing them to be in 3 quarters, 4 quarters to score the likes of behind enemy lines or engage in all fronts. We're still limiting them access to 2 primary objectives. We are really trying to have them just occupy 2 quarters in the game. And then we go on to how can we include our list building and build it around our strategy that we've chosen. So we really want to approach list building and always have our strategy in mind, never the other way around. Strategy should be the first thing that we think about when we are planning to have a competitive game against our opponent. So we really need to think about our goals. Not just that we're going to win and score more points, but what our actual goal is and how we're going to achieve them. The manner in which that we are going to grasp victory. So we've got to consider what pressures are we going to put on, how we're going to move, how we're going to limit them from scoring points, how we're going to score points. Are we going to win the game by being durable? Are we going to win by pressure? Are we going to be too fast for them to touch? These are the basic strategy that we have to consider. And then the units that we select always have to be selected keeping in mind that they need to help us to achieve our goals. They need to be able to play out our strategy and lean into our tactics that we're going to use. If our strategy, for example, revolves around a movement and not engaging with the enemy, well then our slow units going to be beneficial. Our high damage output units that are slow are going to be beneficial. It depends all how we're going to play. If they're going to be there as a distraction to soak up damage, if they're going to distract the opponent thinking this is a key part of the army whilst we move around the board, that's fine. But if we're just taking them because they're high damage output units and they don't lead into our strategy, then are they actually going to be beneficial to us? Equally, if a detachment has poor stratagems and enhancements, but the detachment rule really allows us to achieve our goals, it might be more beneficial. If we have a stratagem that might give us sustained hits once, that's quite a good sounding stratagem. But does it lean into what we're going to do if the detachment rule is quite poor? An example is the Stormlands Task Force. Most of the enhancements and stratagems are built around the mounted keyword, which aren't really going to be much use with the units that we have available. And they're not really that great as standalones either, even if they weren't linked to the mounted keyword. But we do have a detachment rule that allows us to advance and still be able to charge, and fall back and still be able to charge. But what this allows us to do is lean into having a fast army with lots of movement that has a long combat threat range. Not just a threat range to do damage, but to tie up units to apply pressure, to show up on parts of the board in engagement range and outside of engagement range in a turn that your opponent does not expect. We've got to consider things such as like if we want to hold an objective. Now the unit we choose, they might have quite a good standard gun, or you might be able to update the gun to a plasma gun or something such as that. But the core part of this unit, core part of our stratagem and how we're going to use this unit is to hold an objective. Then really, if they've got the ability to change the gun for, say, a storm shield, that's going to be much more beneficial for us. If we've got, say, Vanguard veterans, for example, and we want to push them into the mid board to occupy space, take an early objective, and stand on it for as long as possible and apply pressure and force the opponent to react because we're scoring too many points. Now, do we really want them to all have pistols? Or do we want to swap that for a storm shield where they're going to be able to hold that objective for much longer, especially if they're just holding it for us to move on to with more units to occupy the space a little bit more rigorously with higher OC and higher durable units? Are we just phasing the way we are approaching this objective to come in a wave where we show up early, we hold on, and then we arrive in force and keep it for the rest of the game? And if we're looking at an Alpha Strike list, you might have a unit that's got a profile that seems good on paper. It has a large amount of strength, strength 9, 10, 11. It's got a decent amount of attacks, high AP, damage D6 plus wherever. But if it's got a 12-inch range, an 18-inch range, are you going to be able to utilize it in turns 1 or 2 to Alpha Strike? Possibly not. Is it going to be durable enough to stand on the front line if you do want to get that 18-inch shots off? Possibly not. Then do you have to utilize a transport to try and get it forward? Well, you're spending points on a transport. Does it have firing deck? If not, you're going to be struggling to line up your targets turn 1. If you push it forward and jump out, is it going to be able to line up your shots? And if it can, is it just going to die right away? Is it going to trade well enough? Whereas you might swap this out for a unit that doesn't do quite as much damage, but it has that longer threat range. It's going to make your opponent set up differently in their deployment zone. It's going to give you more flexibility to use this damage consistently in turns 1 and 2. There's all aspects we need to consider when choosing a unit. It's not about what is just good on paper, what the internet says is good. It's whether it suits the strategy and the style of play and how you want to achieve your goals. You always need to consider that the best unit isn't always the best. The best unit is the one that helps you achieve your goals. Now, we can show up with the high damage unit and look good, play well, and lose in turn 5 because we haven't achieved our goals. Or we can go for the units that are going to put us in a really strong position and give us that platform in turns 4 and 5 to turn up the pressure and make sure we win the game. So, in conclusion, got a couple of thoughts and bits to think about. Strategy is our overarching victory goal. This is the style of play we want to carry out during the game. It's how we reach our victory. It's the speed we play. It's the pressure we achieve. It's the movement we look. It's the way we want to shape the game to win. Now, once we've decided how we're going to achieve victory, the style we're going to play, we then think about what secondary objectives do we want to score, which secondary objectives really lean into the strategy we want to use. If we want to use a strategy such as being durable, we're probably going to be a little bit more on the slower side in most cases. So do we want to engage in all fronts when we might not be able to score it consistently in all 5 turns? Or do we want to have an objective that just requires us to stand still on an objective, maybe cleansing an objective, doing an action, scoring points for being in the middle of the board? We want to really lean into how the army's playing. We want our secondary objectives to just be scored by doing what the army does, rather than trying to go out of our way to score these points. This really feeds into the tactics we want to employ in the game. If we are going for a fast-moving army, then we really want to be utilizing feints through the middle to push out to the flanks. If we want to be occupying space and never being a stationary target for our opponents, so they have to move, so they lose access to the heavy keyword, so they might be outside of auras, so they have to change the target priority where they will often won't get as many shots away as they can, or they will have to overkill a unit. We use this with our tactics by choosing which flanks to operate down, choosing the way we bait opponents to move. Do we have fight and fail where we can zoom forward, shoot, and then move into a position where we're out of sight? Now, this might not seem that all beneficial, thinking how is the opponent going to think about this? Well, they have to then consider what we're going to do in the next turn. Do they have to try and move to take us out, to get a charge into us? Because this is going to be a key unit there. It's going to pop out again, could fire and fade again, but is also going to have the movement to move into their deployment zone. take an objective, score a secondary objective, choose the targets it wants to target, it has to consider this right away because we've decided to apply pressure early on, be close to the deployment zone but out of sight. They have to then consider what to do. It's only once we decide the tactics we want to use, the flanks we want to go down, where we want to access the space, where we want to restrict the space, how we want to take primary objectives and what secondary objectives we want to score, then we think about our list building. If we are going to be durable, what are the most durable units? What enhancements lead into this durability? How can we get them quickly into the place where the durability matters to scorers points? Pointless of them being durable if they're sat in our deployment zone and it takes them 3 turns to get to a mid-board objective. We've then spent 3 turns not scoring that primary and struggling to score that secondary. So if we are durable and we want to get on that mid-board, how can we get there with this durability? And if we're a fast army, it's like we will probably lack a bit of durability ourselves. So how can we utilize the space with the units we choose? Are we going to choose units that are slightly slower and slightly more durable for more flexibility? Or are we going to choose the units that are really fast but a bit squishy? But then we have to think about the secondaries they feed into. Going on to engage on all fronts, well, we can move down a lot of the channels and hide behind terrain. So we want units maybe with smaller profiles. So if we're looking at Drukhari, maybe taking a Ravager or a Rager isn't going to be all that good, but a Venom on the other hand has a small profile that is easier to hide to get our line of sight to score us those points and stop the opponent from targeting them. If you like the video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to see all future content. If you want to support the channel, consider getting a membership or popping across to Patreon. Check out these other videos, take it easy, I'll see you next time.